In the 1900 letter to Mrs. Besant, K.H. wrote, "The cant about masters must be silently but firmly put down. Let the devotion and service be to that supreme spirit, alone of which one is a part. Namelessly and silently we work, and the continual references to ourselves and the repetition of our names raises up a confused aura that hinders our work." I think Mrs. Besant overreacted to that statement. There's no doubt that the adepts did not want casual reference to them all the time, especially when people were asking for personal help. They asked it of them like a prayer to a saint. They also asked HPB to take personal messages to them for help. She refused strongly to do that, said she would never do it. So for a long time, as a result of that statement from KH, the people in the Theosophical Society did not talk about the masters. Although the masters did not appear often in public, no less than 30 reputable people living in HPB's day reported they had seen and conversed with at least one of them in the flesh. Now, people who never saw them began to wonder, were they living men or gods? Who were they? What were they all about? And HPB tried to clear up the mystery, and in the Masters of Wisdom, I tried to clear up the misunderstandings. It was actually one of the reasons I wrote the book, because there's so much misunderstanding about these men. In HPB's day, the masters wrote those letters. When they wrote those letters, they were more commonly called the brothers. They were also known as adepts and Mahatmas. The term master was only meant in the sense of a schoolmaster. It was not meant in the sense of a god or some extraterrestrial creature. We know these men were historical figures because we have no less than 140 of their letters now housed in the British Library in London. I have personally handled those letters in the days when they allowed you to actually hold them in your hand. Although Blavatsky tells us there were at least several hundred masters in her day, the correspondence we have is mainly from one called Kutumi, or KH, and a lesser number from one called Morya, sometimes signing his name with an M. The latter, that is Morya, was HPB's principal teacher. Now, in a letter to their chief correspondent in India, Alfred Percy Sinnett, they explained that the adepts are 100% human, and except when using their occult powers, are ordinary men. Well, I'm not so sure they were ordinary, but in any case, limited to brain consciousness. In letter 85B, KH wrote, "Whenever these powers are needed, the sovereign will unlocks the door to the inner man, the adept, who can emerge and act freely, but on condition that his jailer, the outer man, will be either completely or partly paralyzed, as the case may require, that is, either mentally, physically, mentally but not physically, physically but not entirely mentally, neither, but with an Akashic film interposed between the outer and the inner man." He goes on to say, the smallest exercise of occult power, then, as you will now see, requires an effort. We may compare it to the inner muscular effort of an athlete preparing to use his physical strength. As no athlete is likely to be always amusing himself at swelling his veins in anticipation of having to lift a weight, so no adept can be supposed to keep his will in constant tension and the inner man in full function. When there is no immediate need for it, When the inner man rests, the adept becomes an ordinary man, limited to his physical senses and the functions of his physical brain. Habit sharpens the intuitions of the latter, yet is unable to make them supersensuous. The inner adept is ever ready, ever on the alert, and that suffices for our purposes. At moments of rest, then, his faculties are at rest also. When I sit at my meals, or when I am dressing, reading, or otherwise occupied, I am not thinking even of those near me. And Joao Cole, who was one of his students living nearby, can easily break his nose to blood by running it in the dark against a beam. Because he, as he did the other night, just because instead of throwing a film, he had foolishly paralyzed all his senses while talking to and with a distant friend, and I remained placidly ignorant of the fact. I was not thinking of him, hence my ignorance. You see, if he were thinking of him, he would get it right away. Even many of us, including myself, can sometimes do that. Sometimes I can tell you exactly what someone is thinking in front of me. Not often, I'm no adept, but you can understand from maybe having that experience yourself how an adept can do it at will. So when he's thinking of a person, he's aware of them fully, and when not, it's as though they didn't exist. From the aforesaid, you may well infer that an adept is an ordinary mortal at all moments of his daily life, but those when the inner man is acting. KH, he goes on in his letter, when writing, is not an adept. A non-adept is fallible. Therefore, KH may very easily commit mistakes. KH goes on to say that likely mistakes would include mistakes of punctuation that will often change entirely the whole sense of a sentence. Idiomatic mistakes, very likely to occur, especially when writing as hurriedly as I do. Mistakes arising from occasional confusion of terms that I had to learn from you, since it is you who are the author of rounds, rings, earthly rings, etc. When a child, HPB had, that's the end of the quote from the letter. When a child, HPB had visions of a tall Indian man who she thought had once saved her life. She had fallen from a horse and felt she was lifted up to safety by the invisible arm of her protector. As a young woman in 1851, she was in London at the time of the Great Exhibition, which is sort of a World's Fair. When watching a parade of delegates from the colonies, she saw the man of her visions in the flesh. You can imagine how she felt. She was overwhelmed, and she ran out into the street to greet him, and he waved her back. She met Morya, she claims, later in Hyde Park, later in Ramsgate, and possibly in a shell grotto in Marsgate to discuss the proposed mission. The shell grotto had been found some years ahead before that, and nobody knew who made it, and it had various symbols in it, none of them Judeo-Christian, and something that maybe looked like an altar. But in any case, according to Joy Mills, who researched all this, she likely met Morya there to discuss things, because Hyde Park was overwhelmed with people. It was like Times Square in New York on New Year's Eve. There were hundreds and hundreds of people there. There would hardly have been a place to speak quietly. Now, founding of the TS as an organization dedicated she said, let me go back. Morya said she was selected as the best available to be their agent, to bring their knowledge into the West. They knew she had lots of faults, and they told her what they were, but they selected her as the best available. So now, founding of the TS as an organization dedicated to forming a nucleus of the Universal Brotherhood of Humanity was their idea. They did not found it but they inspired its founding. They wanted an organization dedicated to universal brotherhood. That was their primary purpose in inspiring the founding of the society, and it is still the central mission of the society, even though many have long forgotten it. Now, they were a little disappointed at some point with the Theosophical Society. K.H. wrote, "My brother and I," that is Morya and he, "are the only among the brotherhood who have at heart the dissemination, to a certain extent, limit, of our doctrines. None of my fellow brothers, with the exception of M, will help me in this work, not even our semi-European Greek brother, the Master Hilarion. With permission from the Brotherhood to begin the experiment, some strict rules were applied. It was stipulated that the experiment should be made independently of our personal management, that there should be no abnormal interference by ourselves." Now, there were many people, as I said before, at least 30, who saw these men physically during the time of HPB, and after even. Now, Alcott, the president founder of the society, wrote, as many of you know, old diary leaves, his memoirs. He wrote it because he said already there was misconceptions about the society's founding and its principal founders. So he writes this: "I was quietly reading with all my attention centered on my book." That was when they were living in New York at 48 or 47th Street and 8th Avenue. The building still stands, by the way. It got called the Lamasery by the press. I was sitting with all my attention centered on my book. Nothing in the evening's incidents had prepared me for seeing an adept in his astral body. I had not wished for it, tried to conjure it up in my fancy, nor in the least expected it. All at once, as I read, with my shoulder a little turned to the door, from the door, there came a gleam of something white in the right-hand corner of my right eye. I turned my head, dropped my book in astonishment, and saw towering above me, in his great stature, an Oriental clad in white garments and wearing a headcloth or turban of amber striped fabric, hand embroidered in yellow floss silk. Long raven hair hung from under his turban to his shoulders, his black beard parted vertically on the chin in the Rajput fashion was twisted up at the ends and carried over the ears. His eyes were alive with soul fire, eyes which were at once benign and piercing in glance, the eyes of a mentor and a judge, but softened by the love of a father who gazes on a son needing counsel and guidance. He was so grand a man, so imbued with the majesty of moral strength, so luminously spiritual, so evidently above average humanity, that I felt abashed in his presence and bowed my head and bent my knee as one does before a god or a godlike personage. A hand was lightly laid on my head. A sweet, though strong voice bade me be seated, and when I raised my eyes, the presence was seated in the other chair beyond the table. He told me he had come at the crisis when I needed him, that my actions had brought me to this point, that it lay with me alone whether he and I should meet often in this life as co-workers for the good of mankind, that a great work was to be done for humanity, and I had the right to share in it if I wished, that a mysterious tie, not now to be explained to me, had drawn my colleague and myself together, a tie which could not be broken, however strained it might be at times. Suddenly, the thought came into my mind, what if this be but a hallucination? What if HPB has cast a hypnotic glamour over me? I wish I had some tangible object to prove to me he was really here, something that I might handle after he is gone. Now, as I mentioned before, K.H. said in his letter, if he was thinking of someone, he was in rapport with them and would get it. Well, he was in rapport with Alcott at that minute, and he got Alcott's thought. So the master smiled kindly, as if reading my thought, untwisted the turban from his head, benignly saluted me in farewell, and was gone. His chair was empty. I was alone with my emotions. Not quite alone, though, for on the table lay the embroidered headcloth, a tangible and enduring proof that I had not been overlooked or psychically befooled, but had been face to face with one of the elder brothers of humanity, one of the Mahatmas of our dull pupil race. That turban is now in the archives in Adyar, India. Now, there were other counters with adepts. I'll just share a couple with you. In August 1881, Damodar Mavalankar gave the following testimony. I have at least seen about half a dozen brothers on various occasions in broad daylight in open places and have talked to them, not only when Madame Blavatsky was in Bombay, but even when she was far away and I here. I have also seen them when I was traveling. I was taken to the residence of some of them, and once when Colonel Alcott and Madame Blavatsky were with me. Further than that I cannot say. I shall not give any more information either about them or the places they reside in, for I am under a solemn obligation of secrecy, and the subject is too sacred for me to be trifled with. I may, however, mention that I know Kuthumi Lao Singh personally, and have seen and conversed with him when Madame Blavatsky was here, and also when she was far away. Another one, in 1883, William T. Brown, I believe he was an American, he met K.H. in the daylight when it would have been much more difficult for anyone to fool him by masquerading as a master in crafty arrangements of muslin and bladder. Brown reported, on the afternoon of the 19th of November, I saw the master in broad daylight and recognized him, and on the morning of the 20th he came to my tent and said, now you see me before you in the flesh. Look and assure yourself it is I. And he left a letter of instructions and silk handkerchief. Later in life it appears that Brown began to believe that instead of meeting the master he'd been fooled by, as Madame Coulomb had charged. However, K.H. confirmed the visit in a letter to Brown when he wrote, if an Eastern, especially a Hindu, had even half a glimpse but once of what you had, he would have considered himself blessed the whole of his life. You saw and recognized me twice at a distance. You knew it was I and no other. What more do you desire? Now, I mentioned Madame Coulomb. She and her husband conspired to, they were rebuffed at Adyar for various reasons. We won't go into that. But in any case, they were now trying to get revenge on HPB. And they claimed that she wrote the Mahatma letters, and they claimed there was a little place in her room where the letters would come. She would get the letters and write them herself. There are lots of false claims like that, and it upset HPB very much so much that the Adepts said they couldn't use her for several weeks because she was so emotionally in turmoil. Now, what the Adepts taught, largely in response to questions by Sinnett. Sinnett was a veritable question mark, they said, when it came to pushing for occult information. In response to his over-enthusiastic requests, K.H. told him, quote, the occult science is not one in which secrets can be communicated of a sudden by written or even verbal communication. If so, all the brothers would have to do would be to publish a handbook of the art, which might be taught in schools as grammar is. It is the common mistake of people that we willingly wrap ourselves and our powers in mystery, that we wish to keep our knowledge to ourselves, and of our own will refuse, wantonly and deliberately, to communicate it. The truth is that until the neophyte attains to the conditions necessary for that degree of illumination to which and for which he is entitled and fitted, most, if not all, of the secrets are incommunicable. The receptivity must be equal to the desire to instruct. The illumination must come from within. Till then, no hocus pocus of incantations or mummery or appliances, no metaphysical lectures or discussions, no self-imposed penance can give it. All these are but a means to an end. All we can do is direct the use of such means as have been empirically found by experience of ages to conduce to the required object. And this was and has been no secret for thousands of years. Fasting, meditation, chastity of thought, word and deed, silence for periods of time to enable nature herself to speak to him who comes to her for information, government of the animal passions and impulses, utter unselfishness of intention, the use of certain incense and fumigations for physiological purposes have been published as the means since the days of Plato and Iamblichus in the West, and since the far earlier times of our Indian rishis. Now, the question of death and what happens after and rebirth, of course, came up. We're all interested in that. When I gave my foundations course years ago, I only had a brief portion of it dedicated to life beyond physical death. The interest was so strong that I made it a full lecture. So from death to rebirth, the near-death experiences have provided some evidence that consciousness may exist outside of the body. The most convincing of these reports that the clinically dead person traveled to clinically dead person traveled to another place, reported on what was there, and had it verified later. Now, of course, many of the experiences reported in the near-death experiences can be explained by processes of the dying brain. I don't accept that, but I realize it's a possibility. But this particular one, traveling to a distance when the body lay comatose on a gurney, how did that happen if it's all our physical brain? The brain didn't get out of that person's head, travel and come back and put the brain back in the head. This is the one particular report from the NDEs that cannot be explained by processes of the dying brain. Now, the Master tells us that everyone gets a life review at death. Now, remember when I was my first job in New York as a Spanish-English teletypist to Havana, I was worked at a sugar brokerage on Wall Street near the East River. And one of the young execs came into the teletype room one day, and something came up about dying, and he said, I had a total review. I nearly died once, and I had my whole life flash before me. No one will believe me. Well, I had already read about this. I said, I believe you. So it does happen to us. And one of my good friends used to say, by God, Ed, when we die, I hope we get a debriefing. Well, apparently we do, with some sense of the purpose of our life. K.H. wrote, no man dies insane or unconscious, as some physiologists assert. Even a madman or one in a fit of delirium tremens, will have his instant of perfect lucidity at the moment of death, though unable to say so to those present. The man may often appear dead, yet from the last pulsation, from and between the last throbbing of his heart and the moment when the last spark of animal heat leaves the body, the brain thinks, and the ego lives over in those few brief seconds his whole life again. HPB in the Key to Theosophy wrote, For one short instant, the personal becomes one with the individual and all-knowing ego. But this instant is enough to show him the whole chain of causes which have been at work during his life. He sees and now understands himself as he is, unadorned by flattery or self-deception. He reads his life, remaining as a spectator, looking down into the arena he is quitting. He feels and knows the justice of all the suffering that has overtaken him. Now, many appear shortly after death to the loved ones. All the theosophical literature from the Mahatma letters, HPB, and the secondary literature say that that happens, and many people have experienced at the time of death a vision of someone who has, loved one who has just died. Now, KH talks about a gestation period and after death. I don't think he explained that very much, but my good friend and amazing clairvoyant Dora Kunz said that after death, the aura is reorganized. The inner part becomes the outer part. Because of that, she claimed to be able to recognize whether a person was out of body during sleep or dead. A member once asked Dora to find her son, adult son, who had been lost in the woods. And Dora said, I can tell you whether he's alive or dead. I cannot tell you where he is. She couldn't tell physically where the man was, but she could tell whether he was alive or dead. Now there's what is left after we die is sometimes called the shell. It's our emotional, mental remains. Some say that there is a transmigration. I think that's taught in Hinduism, perhaps Buddhism also. But from the Theosophical view, there is no such thing as going backward. The real person always moves forward. Yet there's a grain of truth in transmigration, because it is said that if we live a very base life and our emotions are filled with lust and anger and fear, then the quote, atoms, end quote, of the psychological nature drift toward the animals, and they become part of an animal's emotional nature. But we don't become an animal. I tell you a very amusing story. I had a girlfriend before I met Mary who lived in what we call the West Village, Greenwich Village, and she lived in a brownstone, and of course, if someone had roaches in those buildings, everybody had them. So she would get roaches and she would set off a roach bomb and maybe stay with me for the weekend and go back, and then things were fine for a month. Well, one day I went over to her place and she said, I was listening to the radio and a Hindu was saying, if we're evil in one life, we can come back as an insect in the next. She said, I looked around and I thought, good God, I'm living in a penal colony. So, in her key to Theosophy, Blavatsky explains that crimes and sins committed on a plane of objectivity and in a world of matter cannot receive punishment in the world of pure subjectivity. And she adds, we believe in no hell or paradise as localities, in no objective hellfires and worms that never die, nor in any Jerusalem with streets paved with sapphires and diamonds. What we believe in is a post-mortem state or mental condition such as we are during a vivid dream. You see, karma works on the level in which it was created. If we have done something painful to others in a previous life, eventually that pain will come back to a physical body. It cannot, that's where it has to come back, because that's where it originated. If we have been psychologically ill to people, if we treated them badly psychologically, the karma of that comes back to the psyche in some incarnation. I've had severe back pain for 2.5 years anyway. I won't go into all that, but it's been pretty bad. So likely I'm paying karma for something I did in a physical life previously. Now, in the primary literature of the Theosophical movement, including the writings of HPB and the Adepts, it would appear that perhaps there is no communication between the living and the dead. In the secondary literature of Mrs. Besant and others, it would appear there is some communication between the two. The apparent contradiction may be explained by what K.H. wrote. He explained to Sinnett that in a letter there was no, quote, direct communication between the living and the dead. But he underlined the word direct, implying that there is indirect communication. One must remember that when those letters were written, mediumship was rampant. Every corner in New York had a medium, as they now have a tarot reader. And the mediums claimed they were getting in touch with the living person who had died, and they could even produce the spook in their rooms, you see. So that, of course, was a direct communication, and I believe that's what K.H. meant when he said there is no direct communication with the living and the dead. Now, after death, we slip into a stage called in the literature devachan. In the first stage of devachan, we live out our ideals, and we are not aware of the suffering of loved ones or where they may be physically. Now, according to K.H., those in devachan may contact us. We cannot summon them. I have some evidence of this in my own experience. We had a dear friend who lived in New York for some time. She was a magnificent Scottish country dancer. We teach that, as some of you know. And her sister was also an excellent dancer. And those two sisters were very, very close. Well, eventually, the one, Roz, developed a terminal illness while back in England. And so she came back to New York in the hopes that a doctor would have a better prognosis. Well, they didn't. Eventually, we got a card around Christmas time from the sister Elaine saying we lost Roz in November. Of course we thought about her. We meditated for her. But about a year later, I was sitting quietly at a computer when Mary wasn't here. The house was quiet. And suddenly, without any of my thought of it, Roz appeared to me on my left side, looking down at me with an impish grin. She contacted me. I did not try to contact her. There was a real purpose for that. I wrote to her sister, not having her email address at that point, gave her my email address, and within a week after she got the letter, she emailed me and said, your letter came at such an important time. I was feeling so down about Roz. Your letter cheered me up no end. Roz always said she would let me know if she was all right after she died, but she wouldn't come to me like that. It would have frightened me. So she went to you. And then she said Roz loved her home and renovated it just before she got ill, and never was able to enjoy it. So here I am, a year later, unable to sell the house. It was sitting there just like it was when Roz died. She said, after your letter, I can sell the house. I'm sure that's what Roz wanted me to do. She knew I would contact her sister, and I never saw Roz again. Now, it's very interesting, again, about this controversy about whether we have communication with the dead. K.H. said, he said we do not fall into devachan all at once, but by stages. Now, I think that must be something like when we're drifting off to sleep. One moment we're awake and aware of our surroundings, the next moment we're asleep. I think it's something like that. And in those moments when we're awake and aware of our surroundings, I think we can be aware of those we love. We don't know where they are physically, but we can be aware of their thoughts and their feelings. There's a great deal of evidence for this. So I think there is some indirect communication in dreams and in that way that I mentioned with Roz. So I think that the controversy can be settled in that way, that both are somewhat true. Now, in the second stage of devachan, the ideals are being exhausted, the personal self begins to fade away, and finally there's a second death. That death, however, has little resemblance to the physical death that is often preceded by pain and fear. It is more like going to sleep. When that second death occurs, our inner self enters the final stage of devachan, the Arupa or formless stage. It is there that we live in a state of spiritual bliss. HPB says from a few to a few thousand years, depending on our karma we have created during our stay in the world of causes, the physical world. Blavatsky, in the Key to Theosophy, assures us that that just, quote, as the man at the moment of death has a retrospective insight into the life he has led, so at the moment he is reborn on earth, the ego, awakening from the state of devachan, has a prospective vision of the life which awaits him and realizes all the causes that have led to it. He realizes them and sees the future because it is between devachan and rebirth that the ego regains his full monastic, that is, mental consciousness, and re-becomes for a short time the God he was before. In compliance with karmic law, he first descended into matter and incarnated in the first man of flesh. The golden thread sees all its pearls and misses not one of them. Those convinced that there is no survival of death, Blavatsky says, will sleep through to their next incarnation. Not punishment, merely the result of their mindset. We know at least two people who were convinced there was no such thing as life after death. And I spoke to their relatives, and they said that, I asked, did you ever feel the person around you, your husband, your wife, whoever it was? They said, no, we didn't. I think that's because those individuals were so convinced there wasn't life after death, they were simply in a deep sleep until the next incarnation. So in a way, if we believe there's no such thing as life after death, we have what Blavatsky calls a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now karma, there's a lot of talk about karma now, but there wasn't in the day of HPV. And now everybody knows the word, even if they don't believe such a thing exists. You hear it everywhere. The adepts do not agree with the popular simplistic version of karma. They teach, first of all, that karma is the fundamental law of the universe. All of nature's laws derive from karma. Karma translates action. We may say that action is equivalent to motion. Motion is action. So karma may be thought of as the sum total of the laws of motion at every level of consciousness and matter. Therefore, the fact that the earth revolves around the sun is karma. Some say there are no accidents, but the adepts say there are accidents. When a person is killed before their due date, if we can call it that, KH says that such an untimely death will be balanced out in a future incarnation. Everything that happens to us is not personal karma from the past. If we trip and fall and break a bone, it does not mean we broke someone's bone in a past life. It probably simply means we were careless, and gravity, karma, pulled us down. Whatever state of consciousness and matter whatever state of consciousness and matter actions are created, the karma of that action is received in the same state at a future time. Now, the Adepts and HPB talk about the path, the spiritual path. HPB claims that one of the masters, probably Morya, gave her something and said, "Give this to those you teach." Many of you are familiar with it. You can get it online, I'm sure. Behold the truth before you, a clean life, an open mind, a pure heart, an eager intellect, an unveiled spiritual perception, a brotherliness for one's co-disciple, a readiness to give and receive advice and instruction, a loyal sense of duty to the teacher, a willing obedience to the behests of truth once we have placed our confidence in and believe that teacher to be in possession of it, a courageous endurance of personal injustice, a brave declaration of principles, a valiant defense of those who are unjustly attacked, and a constant eye to the ideal of human progression and perfection which the secret science depicts. These are the golden stairs up the steps of which the learner may climb to the temple of divine wisdom. Briefly, that's the life we are to live. You can spend many, many hours, many weeks, many days thinking, pondering on those steps. KH tells us the greatest obstacle on that path, greatest ones, are selfishness, pride, and egoism. You see, we are identified with the me when we commit all of those alleged sins, you see. We have to learn not to identify with the me. We don't get rid of our personality. The adepts have very clear and obvious personalities which you can detect in their letters. So you don't get rid of the personality, you don't get rid of motions or the ability to think. You get rid of the identity with those aspects of our nature. Many today wonder if the masters are still living and if they are in contact with some individual as they were in the past. We do not know for sure. Some know everything, of course, and are willing to share, but if we're honest, we don't know. But we must remember that the adept is not the physical body. The adept or master is the fully developed inner self, neither male nor female. They have often taken male bodies, but they have also been known to take female bodies. Why, one might ask, don't they take female bodies? Well, there may be possibly two reasons for that. One is the menses, which would be a problem for them every month. The other is that until recently, who would have listened to a woman? They would never have been able, nobody would have listened to them if they were women. So they took male bodies. We don't know why, but they have done that more often than taking a female body. So the adept is one who can identify with and function from that state of consciousness called buddhi manas, the true inner self. Now there's some evidence that at least one person in the late 1900s was in direct contact with the two masters we know as KH and M. It was Dora Kunz, past president of the Theosophical Society in America, past president of the New York Theosophical Society. I was Dora's friend for about 40 years. So I'd like to say a little bit about what I knew of her, and then to read a short portion of a talk she gave in Philadelphia in 1955. In some ways, Dora was similar to HPB. When some members complained about the difficult personality of HPB, KH responded that she could not help it because they had to, quote, remove one of her principles, end quote. He added, she is a psychological cripple. Now, we don't know what he meant by removing one of her principles, but apparently it was necessary that they have constant and complete communication with her, that they could be aware of her at all times, so that in case she began to spill an occult secret, which might be used wrongly by those listening, they could stop her. Dora was like that. She could be a spiritual giant, and she could be a difficult character. As many of you know, KH once wrote, we have one word for all aspirants, try. When Dora was president of the Theosophical Society in America, she lived in the main building on the Alcott campus. One night, a member was walking by her door in the wee hours of the morning, and she heard Dora saying, I am trying, I am trying. Dora was in her room alone. Could it be she was speaking with one of the adepts? I'd like to close by reading a portion of Dora's talk on the masters. In it, she describes the facial expressions of the masters, something that is in none of the theosophical literature, and something she would never have done had she not seen them. Dora knew the theosophical literature very well, yet when she gave a talk, she would always say, I am not speaking from the books, I am speaking from my own experience. In her talk on the masters in 1955, Dora described the masters in her own words from her own experience. Dora, I knew her quite well. We were very good friends. We were fond of one another. We used to make each other laugh a lot. She would never talk about something in her work that she didn't experience. I remember once when Nixon was in China and people got interested in acupuncture, we asked her before her meditation class what about acupuncture? She said, "I don't know." And then she said, "A man from Russia is going to meet me next week. He has a machine that is allegedly reveals acupuncture points." Well, the following week we asked her, and she said, yes, he went over the acupuncture points. It beeped every time it hit an acupuncture point. She said, "I looked at the aura and I saw what it was. It was these little carrots. I'd seen them all my life. I didn't think they meant much. They were the acupuncture points." So when he would beep at one, a few of them, then she realized what it was. She'd say, "Well, put it here," and it would beep. "Put it here," and it would beep. So she was able to detect that. So her talk, in part, done in Philadelphia, I have the transcript. If anyone wants it, I can send it to you by email. It's also in my book, Masters of Wisdom, as an appendix. She wrote, or she said rather, and this was the transcript: "When you know the masters, you cannot help but be devoted to them. But they do not want us to worship them, and the Theosophical Society was not meant to be a religious organization. I think sometimes we put the masters on a pedestal and feel like little worms below. Some think if they feel a tremendous sense of devotion to the masters, they can sit in a chair and do nothing, like being in a monastery. That is not enough. The Theosophical Society was not founded on that principle, and it will not fulfill its destiny if we unconsciously treat it like a church. The churches have a tremendous work to fulfill, uplifting the people, giving them that faith and bringing out their devotion. Devotion is a fine thing, but the masters require a great deal more. We have to feel a sense of being colleagues with the masters, engaged in a great work together. As I said before, the more you know about the masters, you cannot help but have a feeling of love and reverence. But that is not why the Theosophical Society is in existence. There are thousands of members of the Theosophical Society, but there are very few Theosophists. It is very easy to sign a piece of paper and say you want to join the society and that you believe in brotherhood. But brotherhood is something we should live instead of talking about. The Theosophical Society is the testing ground for brotherhood. It is the place to let ourselves grow, to let ourselves understand that we are not to be dogmatic, to let ourselves learn to get along with one another, whether we like one another or not. You must be willing to have differences of opinion. You must be willing to stand the acid test, even if you are called names. It is you who are being tested. If you walk out because one individual says something nasty to you, you are failing the test of brotherhood. How can I try to convey something of the experiencing of masters? I shall try to give a brief description of what I think are some of the characteristics of the two masters that we always talk about, the Master KH and the Master Morya. As I said previously, there has never been a time in my life when the masters have not been real to me, and I shall try to describe them from my point of view. Master Morya was the master of HPB. If you read the Mahatma letters, you will get some sense of his personality. As you know, he is an Indian. He is very tall, and he comes from a very princely family. I think that if you are in his presence, you have that sense that you are in the presence of someone who is every inch a king. That feeling really is true because he gives a sense of absolute integrity. That may sound like a strange word to use. What is meant by absolute integrity? All of us have masks. All of us think in terms of little things that are not true. If you are in the Master's presence, for the moment, all of that gets wiped out. All the little things which are not really true, which are not part of what we see as ourselves, are wiped out. If you are in his presence, you meet a person who is so absolutely in the center of his being, who is so absolutely true that you yourself get a sense of being thrown back into the absolute center of yourself. You get a sense even of the greatness and integrity of yourself. In his presence, you could not think of something childish or mean. Of course, there is also a tremendous sense of strength, and a strength which enables you to carry something through to the end, which you have started. It is a strength that has no end. In the Master's letters, you will note he is very economical with words. There is also complete economy in emotion, in movement, and in everything, even in his looks. He has a tremendously noble face, but whatever he feels is not reflected in it. It is a steady face. The facial muscles change very little because it is the face of a person who is completely at one with himself and who is cast in a solid granite mold of unity, integrity, and strength. I think that's a brief personification of the Master Morya. The Master KH is totally different in many respects. Their two personalities could not be more different, yet they have a sense of tremendous devotion to one another, as you will notice in the letters. They have been colleagues for so many lives. It is really a beautiful thing to notice how they work together. She saw that. She wouldn't have said that if she didn't see it. The Master KH is tall, but not as tall as the Master Morya. He has a very noble face. Whatever he feels shows. Pictures could never do him justice because his expression varies from moment to moment. He writes beautiful English in the Mahatma letters. He has a great feeling for music and the arts. I think that what the Master KH conveys is a feeling of love. You might think that if you were in the presence of the Master's presence, you would feel very small and shy. Perhaps the Master Morya would give you that feeling a little, but not the Master KH. You would have a sense of expanding consciousness, just as you would with the Master Morya. But the Master KH has the great gift of making a person feel as though you had known him all your life. Don't you think that is a great gift of love? He is a person who is so much a personification of love. It draws from me all the love I am capable of, and so it draws from any person who comes into contact with him, a sense of outgoing love. That sense of outgoing love is finally a sense of yourself being a perfect being. Now that's the end of the transcript. Many want to get in touch with the Masters, but they do not respond to personal requests for meetings, either physically or out-of-body meetings. As I said earlier, they don't do that. The Masters say they are only interested in working with people who are motivated to help them in their work for humanity. In one letter, KH says that anyone actively doing their best for humanity is automatically in the sphere of their influence. They may not ever have heard of Masters. They may be inspired. They may think it's coming from their own selves, some inspiration of what to do. And that inspiration may be coming directly from one of the adepts who have been aware of the effort the person has to help humanity. From my own experience, I can say that can be done. Some years ago, I gave a week program on the Mahatma letters at our national headquarters. I left the last day for questions and comments. I asked the group to bring questions and/or write them on paper without names, and we would discuss them. The last day arrived. I had about an hour and a half to go. I asked if there were any questions. There were none. I asked if there were any written questions. There were none. I got quiet, and I said what I wanted to say about the Masters. I was so inspired that I felt as though I were a witness to what I was saying. Years later, I told Dora Kunz about that experience. Dora would never listen to what she thought was nonsense. She would literally call you an idiot and walk away. As I spoke about the incident, she smiled beautifully and quietly shook her head in the affirmative. She knew what had happened. Somehow, I had gotten into the sphere of influence from the masters. I'm convinced that anyone who wants to work for the greater good of humanity will be within the sphere of their influence. If that effort is personal, it will fail. If it is impersonal, it will succeed. Thank you all.